The heavens are telling of the glory of God. Look up and seek His wisdom from above.
In this series, we've been talking about how a person is to understand the Bible. We began with attitudes and rules used to be successful. Now we're making some practical applications by looking at Scripture and seeing how they are to be interpreted and sometimes how they end up misinterpreted. I want to spend some time in Isaiah 53. This prophecy about Jesus is so important. It lays out His suffering and death for the transgressions of His people. In other words, His crucifixion. Perhaps you've always taken it for granted that this chapter applies to the crucifixion of Jesus. Did you know that Jews have another interpretation that takes it in a completely different direction? Now, you'd think a Jew who understands Hebrew would look at the Hebrew text of this chapter and be unable to miss its true meaning. Well, that could make you wonder if the Christian is understanding it correctly. So let's take a look at the Jewish perspective and see if they have a valid point as they interpret this chapter entirely differently. Let's start with what they believe this passage is actually about. The Jew claims that Isaiah is writing about their having suffered unjustly as a nation at the hands of sinners. The servant that is suffering in this chapter becomes the nation of Israel, in their view. Because of the evil of sinful men, they have been subjected to mistreatment and death. If you don't examine Isaiah and their argument very carefully, this can seem reasonable as they point out the Holocaust and other persecutions. The question, however, is not whether the Jewish nation has ever suffered. The question is, does Isaiah really mean what they are claiming for it? Let's begin with a couple of their claims that the text isn't translated correctly in our English versions. We'll start with verse 5. But He was pierced through for our transgressions, He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon Him, and by His scourging we are healed. The Jew tells us that the word for should really be translated because of or as a result of. Their contention is that the suffering servant is suffering at the hands of people's sins. However, when we make their so-called correction, we come up with this. But He was pierced through because of our transgressions. He was crushed because of our iniquities. The chastening because of our well-being fell upon Him, and by His stripes we are healed. Well, I don't mind translating it that way. It certainly doesn't prove their position, however. Changing these words doesn't demand that we understand that this is a case of sinners engaging in their sin of persecuting Jews, which is what the Jew claims. Jesus was crucified because of our transgressions. If we had never sinned, He would not have had to die. The progressive parallelism of this verse leads us to the intended understanding that by His scourging we are healed. When did the scourging of the Jews ever heal anyone? It didn't. So when does the scourging of one man heal other people? Only when His suffering is an atonement for their transgressions. Jesus did die because we sinned. Jesus did suffer as a result of our iniquities. Changing the translation is just an effort to cloud the issue. Verse 9 is another place where the Jew claims we have mistranslated the Hebrew. It reads, His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet He was with a rich man in His death, because He had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in His mouth. The Jew now tells us that we've mistranslated the word death, and that it should be plural, deaths. So it would read, He was with a rich man in his deaths. This seems to play right into their claim that this chapter is about the suffering of the nation, the many people of Israel, at the hands of sinners, rather than the suffering of just one man for sinners. The problem they won't point out to you is that a plural in Hebrew doesn't always mean more than one. That they know this can be seen from their argument on the first verse of the Bible, Genesis 1:1. The word for God in that verse is Elohim, and it is plural in the Hebrew. They argue that the plural doesn't always mean more than one. Well, go figure. If they see that in Genesis 1:1, why don't they see it in Isaiah 53? Because it isn't convenient. So what is the sense of making the word death plural? The plural use becomes clear by looking at another case in Ezekiel 28:8. They will bring you down to the pit, and you will die the death of those who are slain in the heart of the seas. The word death in Hebrew in this text is plural, just like we find in Isaiah 53. The point is not that there are many deaths, but that the way they die is so terrible is that it is like dying over and over again. It was death of deaths. That's what it becomes. The same thing occurs 2 verses later. Well, hold your place here in Isaiah because we're out of time and I want to pick up right here in our next study. I hope you'll join me as we talk about the various servants referred to in Isaiah and more about the Jews' argument that this chapter is not about Jesus Christ.